What is the true measure of an inheritance? Is it found in the rustle of banknotes, the clink of coins, or the heavy, satisfying deed to 100 acres of fertile soil? Or is it something quieter, something that cannot be weighed or counted, something that lives not on paper, but in the landscape of the heart? For Martha, whose world had recently shrunk to the size of a fresh grave on a windswept hill, the question was not rhetorical. It was a cruel joke, delivered in the dry, rustling voice of the town lawyer. She sat on the hard-backed chair in his dusty office, her substantial frame feeling too large for the cramped space, her black morning dress seeming to absorb what little light squeezed through the grimy window. At her feet, a golden retriever named Barley rested his heavy head on her knee, his presence a warm, living anchor in the shifting tides of her grief. Her father, Thomas, a man of few words and calloused hands, was gone. And his last will and testament had just been read. The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, cleared his throat. He avoided her gaze, instead focusing on a crack in the ceiling as he delivered the final, baffling blow. To his only child, Martha, Thomas bequeathed his sole remaining property, a 40-acre plot of useless, granite-strewn land up at Coulter's Gap. A plot of land whose only notable feature was a loud, chaotic, and thoroughly untamable waterfall. Nothing more. No savings. No hidden cache of gold. Just rock, and mist, and noise. A thick silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. From the corner, Mr. Finch, a land speculator who seemed to smell opportunity the way a wolf smells blood, let out a short, pitying puff of air. "Well," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "A sentimental gesture, no doubt. The place is worthless, of course. Can't farm it, can't graze it. The noise alone would drive a man mad. But out of respect for your father, girl, I'll take it off your hands. $20. Cash. The offer hung in the air, an insult wrapped in charity. $20 for the last piece of her father on earth. Martha looked down at Barley, whose tail gave a slow, uncertain thump against the floorboards. She felt a flicker of her father's stubbornness ignite within her. A quiet, unyielding thing. She lifted her chin, her voice soft but steady. "No," she said. "I'll keep it." The lawyer blinked. Mr. Finch actually laughed, a short, sharp bark. But Martha rose, her movements deliberate, and walked out of the office, the dog padding faithfully behind her, leaving the men to their whispers and the echoing sound of her refusal. The town of Redemption was small enough that news traveled faster than a prairie fire on a dry wind. By the time Martha reached the mercantile for flour and salt, the story of her peculiar inheritance was already common knowledge, a piece of gossip to be picked over like corn from a cob. She felt the weight of stairs as she walked down the main street, her sturdy boots kicking up dust. She heard the whispers, faint but sharp, from behind cracker barrels and doorways. Just a waterfall, poor Thomas, God rest him. Must have lost his wits at the end. Her grief was a heavy cloak, and this pity, this communal head-shaking, felt like stones being sewn into its hem. Her body, broad and strong from years of farm work, suddenly felt conspicuous, a landmark for their judgment. She was the big, plain daughter of a man who'd left her nothing but noise. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and condescension. Mr. Finch stood by the counter, a smug king on a small throne, regaling a few idle men with his version of the story. When he saw Martha, a cruel smile played on his lips. He raised his voice so all could hear. "Still holding on to that noisy patch of rock, missy? I'll raise my offer. $25. Could buy you a fine new dress, something with a bit of color." The men chuckled. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at her eyes. She ignored him, placing her order with the storekeeper in a low voice, her gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. As she left, her small sack of provisions in hand, she nearly collided with a figure huddled by the door. It was old woman Hemlock, a woman as ancient and weathered as the hills themselves, who lived on the edge of town and spoke in riddles. The old woman's eyes, pale and sharp as a hawk's, fixed on Martha. She didn't offer pity. Instead, her voice was a dry rasp. "Some water just washes things clean," she said, her gaze unwavering. And some water hides things. The words made no sense, yet they snagged in Martha's mind. She gave a short nod and hurried away, back to the small cabin her father had rented in town, the weight of the community's judgment pressing down on her. That night, with Barley asleep at the foot of her bed, she lay awake, listening. On the quiet night air, carried on the westward breeze, she could just make out a faint, continuous roar. The sound of her inheritance. The sound of her isolation. A week passed, a blur of quiet chores and thick, suffocating grief. The roar on the wind was a constant companion, a question she could not ignore. Was it a monument to her father's faded mind, or was it something else? She had to know. One crisp morning, with the sun still a pale promise in the east, she decided. She packed a canvas sack with a hunk of bread, a canteen of water, and a length of sturdy rope. With Barley trotting eagerly ahead, his golden coat bright against the muted landscape, she set out for Coulter's Gap. The walk was long, uphill, the path growing rougher as she left the town's orbit behind. The air grew cooler, damper, filled with the scent of wet stone and pine. And the sound grew. What had been a distant whisper in town became a murmur, then a rumble, and finally, a deafening, all-consuming roar that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. She rounded a final bend of granite, and there it was. The waterfall. It was more immense than she remembered from childhood visits, a furious, churning curtain of white water crashing down a sheer rock face into a frothing pool below. The spray was a constant, chilling mist that clung to her clothes and hair. The land around it was just as the town said, a tilted shelf of stone and stubborn, twisted trees. Useless. Despair washed over her, cold as the mist. This was it. This was her legacy. A beautiful, terrible, empty thing. Her father had left her nothing. She sank onto a damp, moss-covered boulder, and for the first time since the funeral, she allowed tears to fall, hot against her cold cheeks. But Barley was not still. The dog, usually so calm, was agitated. He ignored the crashing water in front of them and instead scrambled over the slick rocks toward the cliff face itself, getting as close as he dared to the punishing spray. He began to whine, a low, insistent sound, pressing his nose against the dark, wet rock behind the cascade, then looking back at Martha, his brown eyes full of a strange urgency. He was trying to tell her something. Pushing her own sorrow aside, Martha followed him, her heavy boots finding purchase on the treacherous ground. The power of the falling water was terrifying up close, a physical force that pushed against her. She could see what held Barley's attention, the sheer, unbroken wall of granite, slick with algae and moisture, hidden behind the violent veil. There was nothing there. Just solid rock. Still, the dog persisted, letting out a sharp bark that was swallowed by the roar. He was certain. And watching him, a tiny, fragile seed of curiosity began to sprout in the barren ground of Martha's grief. Returning to the quiet of her father's rented cabin felt like entering another world, one where the silence was as loud as the waterfall's roar had been. The memory of Barley's strange insistence wouldn't leave her? It was a loose thread, and she felt compelled to pull it. If the answer wasn't at the falls, perhaps it was here, tucked away in the simple, sparse belongings her father had left behind. She began to search, not for money, but for meaning. She ran her hands over his worn work clothes, his chipped mug, the few books he kept by his bed, almanacs and manuals on crop rotation. It was the life of a simple farmer. Nothing more. Then, at the bottom of a heavy wooden chest, beneath a folded wool blanket, she found it. A leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with her father's neat, compact script. For hours, she sat at the small table, Barley's head once again on her lap, and read. Most of it was exactly what she expected, notations on rainfall, the price of seed, the birth of a calf, the mending of a fence. The mundane poetry of a life lived by the seasons. Her heart ached with a fresh wave of loss. But as she neared the end, the entries began to change. The familiar notes on farming grew sparse, replaced by strange, obsessive observations about the land at Coulter's Gap. There were detailed sketches of rock formations, calculations of water flow, and notes on the position of the sun at different times of day. And then she saw a recurring symbol, drawn over and over again, a simple, elegant spiral. Beside it were cryptic phrases. 12 paces from the bent old sun at noon strikes the granite lip. Listen for the echo, not the roar, and it felt like madness. The desperate scribbling of a mind untethered from reality. Her hope, so tentatively raised, began to plummet. Had the town been right all along? Tucked into a small pocket sewn inside the journal's back cover, her fingers found something else. A small, oiled leather pouch. Inside was not a coin or a keepsake, but a single, heavy key. It was made of a dark, burnished metal that felt warm to the touch and showed no sign of rust. It was unlike any key she had ever seen, its design intricate and strange. It fit no lock in the cabin. She had checked every box, every door. It was a key without a purpose, a clue without a question. Holding the key in one hand and the journal in the other, Martha felt a renewed resolve harden within her. This was not madness. This was a puzzle. And her father had left her all the pieces. The next morning, Martha was back at the waterfall, but this time she came with a purpose. The journal was tucked securely in her belt, the strange key a heavy, solid weight in her pocket. The roar of the water was no longer just noise, it was a challenge. Barley, sensing her determination, bounded ahead, his tail held high. She found the bent alder tree easily, its trunk warped by years of wind. From its base, she carefully paced off 12 steps, just as the journal instructed. Her final step landed her on a flat, wide ledge, perilously close to the pounding spray. She waited. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, its light glinting off the water droplets that filled the air like a swarm of tiny diamonds. Then, just as the sun reached its zenith, it happened. A single, focused beam of light pierced the mist and struck the rock face directly in front of her, illuminating a patch of granite no bigger than her hand. It was the granite lip from her father's notes. As she moved closer to inspect it, her boot slipped on a patch of slick algae. She cried out, her arms flailing as she lost her balance. Before she could fall, a strong hand gripped her arm, steadying her. "Careful there," a quiet voice said. "These slick rocks have a mind of their own." She looked up to see a young man, broad-shouldered and calm-eyed. It was Samuel, the blacksmith's son. He was checking his trap lines along the creek. He released her arm once she was steady, his expression neutral, not offering the pity or curiosity she expected. He simply saw someone in need of a hand and offered it. His quiet competence was a balm. He saw the journal in her belt, the determined set of her jaw. He glanced at the spot of light on the rock, then back at her. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't mock her quest. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her right to be there. "Let me brace you," he offered, his voice low and even. "I can hold this rope if you need to get closer." He was offering help without judgment, a gift so rare in her world that it almost brought her to tears. She simply nodded, a lump in her throat. With Samuel providing a steady anchor, Martha felt a surge of confidence. She could do this. She was not alone. With the rope tied securely around her waist and Samuel holding the other end, his feet planted firmly on the ledge, Martha could lean out over the churning pool, close enough to touch the waterfall's hidden wall. Barley, perched on a rock nearby, was now in a frenzy of excitement, his barks sharp and urgent. The roar was a physical presence, a deafening thunder that made thought impossible. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the journal's last instruction. Listen for the echo, not the roar. What could it mean? How could one listen for anything in this chaos? She pressed her ear against the cold, vibrating stone, but heard only the deep, resonant thrum of the cascade. Then, she stopped trying to hear with her ears and started to feel with her whole body. She felt the rhythm of the falls, the deep, percussive impacts of tons of water hitting the rocks below. It wasn't one continuous sound. There was a pattern. A heavy beat, a pause of a half-second, then two quick, successive crashes. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, boom, boom. It was a heartbeat. The heartbeat of the mountain. Focusing on that rhythm, she ran her trembling, wet fingers over the sunlit patch of rock. Her fingertips, calloused from work, brushed against something that wasn't natural. A faint, almost imperceptible line in the stone, covered in moss and slime. She scraped it away. It was the spiral from her father's journal, carved shallowly into the granite. She pushed it. Nothing happened. Her heart sank. Then she remembered the rhythm. She waited, feeling the vibrations through the rock. Boom, she waited for the briefest of silences, the echo of the great fall, and then, in the space before the next two crashes, she pushed the spiral again, with all her strength. For a moment, nothing. Then, a deep, grinding shudder ran through the stone beneath her hands, a sound so low it was felt more than heard, a bass note beneath the symphony of the falls. A section of the rock face, a perfect, dark rectangle, receded slowly into the cliff. It wasn't a cave. It was a door. A heavy, metal-banded door, set flush into the mountain itself. And in its center was a keyhole, ornate and strange, a perfect match for the key that rested, heavy and warm, in her pocket. Behind the thundering, shimmering curtain of water, her father had hidden a secret. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying, metallic click, a sound that seemed impossibly loud even amidst the waterfall's roar. It turned smoothly, evidence of her father's meticulous care. Together, Martha and Samuel put their shoulders to the heavy wooden door. It swung inward with a groan of protest, revealing not a damp, dark cave, but a space filled with a soft, ethereal light. The cavern behind the falls was immense, a natural grotto that her father had transformed. The sound of the water was muted in here, a constant, soothing rumble rather than a deafening crash. The light was magical, filtering through the moving curtain of water, dancing and shimmering across the smooth stone walls, casting shifting patterns of silver and gold. The air was cool and dry. It was a sanctuary. But it was more than that. It was a workshop. Along one wall stood a long, sturdy workbench, littered with drafting tools, calipers, and complex-looking metal instruments. The other walls were lined with meticulously organized shelves. But instead of jars of preserves or farming tools, these shelves held books, dozens of them. Books on geology, hydrology, mechanical engineering, and physics. There were geological survey maps of the entire region, drawn with a precise, skilled hand. Rolled up in a corner were huge sheets of drafting paper covered in intricate diagrams of gears, levers, and turbines. On a central table, laid out with reverence, were dozens of labeled rock and mineral samples, each one catalogued with notes on its density and composition. Martha walked through the room in a state of quiet awe. This was the man she never knew. Her father, the quiet, simple farmer, had been a secret scholar, a brilliant, self-taught engineer. He hadn't been losing his mind, he had been engaged in a project of staggering ambition. And at the heart of it all, displayed on a wooden stand like a piece of art, was a large, detailed schematic. It was a design for a water wheel, but one unlike any she had ever seen, a marvel of efficiency and power, designed to perfectly harness the immense, relentless energy of the waterfall just outside. The land wasn't the inheritance. The waterfall wasn't the inheritance. This was the knowledge. The vision. The key to a future she could never have imagined, hidden behind a wall of water and a veil of misunderstanding. Word of a secret cabin behind the Coulter Gap waterfall, brought to town by a reserved but clearly impressed Samuel, spread like wildfire. At first, it was a source of wonder and renewed gossip. The story of Martha's strange inheritance took on the quality of a local legend overnight. But where some saw wonder, others, like Mr. Finch, saw only a miscalculated opportunity. The man's greed, now inflamed by the knowledge that he had dismissed something of immense potential value, curdled into aggressive action. A few days later, as Martha and Samuel were carefully cataloguing the journals and diagrams in the hidden workshop, Mr. Finch appeared at the mouth of the cavern. He was not alone. He had brought with him the town's land registrar, a harried-looking man who clearly wished to be anywhere else. "Ahum," Finch announced, his voice echoing unnaturally in the grotto. "There seems to have been a simple surveying error, Missy." He brandished a rolled-up map. "According to my deeds, this entire cliff face, and the cavern within it, is technically part of my adjacent parcel." A geological anomaly not accounted for in the original survey. It was a blatant, audacious lie. He was using his influence, his standing as a man of business, to try and wrest the discovery from her. This is far too complex for a young woman to manage, he continued, his tone dripping with condescension as he eyed the complex schematics on the table. The mechanics of this, the potential, it's best left to men with a head for business. I'll make sure you're compensated for your discovery. He made it sound as though she had simply stumbled upon it, erasing her father's years of secret, painstaking work. This was the test. The world pushing back, trying to take what was hers. Martha felt a surge of cold fury, but she also felt the solid weight of her father's knowledge settling in her bones. She had spent the last few days not just looking at his work, but studying it, absorbing it, understanding it. She looked at Finch, his smug face illuminated by the shimmering, water-filtered light, and she did not feel fear. She felt the quiet, unshakable strength of her father's legacy flowing through her. She would not let this man steal it. The standoff in the cavern drew a crowd. Word had spread of Finch's challenge, and a dozen or so townspeople had made the trek up to Coulter's Gap to witness the confrontation. They stood in a half-circle just outside the entrance, their faces uncertain, caught between the established power of Mr. Finch and the startling revelation of Martha's inheritance. Old woman Hemlock was there, leaning on a gnarled staff, her gaze missing nothing. Mr. Finch, sensing an audience, became even more pompous. He unrolled his map with a flourish, pointing to a crudely drawn line. As you can see, the boundary clearly runs along the ridge, meaning this entire formation is mine. The land registrar fidgeted, looking at Finch's map and then at Martha, a silent apology in his eyes. But Martha did not shrink. She met Finch's gaze, her expression calm and resolute. "You're mistaken, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice clear and carrying easily over the muted rumble of the falls. She turned to a large, flat-topped chest in the corner of the workshop. With Samuel's help, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, protected from the damp by waxed canvas, were her father's own surveys. She unrolled a huge, beautifully rendered map, its lines drawn with the precision of an artist. She laid it out on the central table. "My father, Thomas, surveyed this land himself 10 years before you ever bought your parcel," she explained, her finger tracing a definitive boundary. "He didn't use wooden stakes that can be moved or rot away. He used geological markers. That granite outcrop. The bend in the creek. This very cliff face. It's all here." Dated and signed, the detail and professionalism of her father's map were undeniable, making Finch look like a child's scrawl. But she wasn't finished. She picked up the large schematic for the water wheel. "You see this as a cave, Mr. Finch? A claim to be made. My father saw it as a foundation." She turned to the gathered townspeople, her voice resonating with a passion she didn't know she possessed. "He wasn't just hiding in here. He was planning. He saw this water not as a nuisance, but as a source of power. Power for a grist mill that won't rely on a dry season. Power for a sawmill that could run day and night. Power for this whole town." She looked directly at old woman Hemlock, a flicker of understanding passing between them. The old woman nodded slowly, her voice a loud rasp for all to hear. "Some water hides things," she said, a slow smile spreading across her wrinkled face. "And some people hide their light." Finch stood sputtering, his lie exposed, his greed laid bare before the entire community. The land registrar, looking immensely relieved, cleared his throat and declared Thomas's survey to be the definitive, binding document. The land, the waterfall, and the secret hidden behind it belonged to Martha. The crowd, silent until now, broke into a murmur of approval, their eyes no longer on her with pity, but with a newfound, profound respect. The months that followed the confrontation were a time of transformation, not just for Martha, but for the entire town of Redemption. The sound of the waterfall, once a symbol of a madman's folly, became the rhythm of progress. It was no longer just the sound of water hitting rock, it was the sound of a future being built. With the full support of the community, and the quiet, tireless expertise of Samuel at her side, Martha began to bring her father's vision to life. Men who had once whispered behind her back now offered their labor, eager to be part of the project. Women who had pitied her now brought her warm meals and offered words of encouragement. Mr. Finch, disgraced and shunned, sold his parcels of land and left town under a cloud of shame. The hidden cabin became a headquarters, a hub of activity and planning. Martha, once an outcast, was now the heart of the enterprise. She moved with a confidence she had never known, her mind sharp, her instructions clear. She knew her father's journals by heart, understood the elegant mechanics of his designs as if they were her own. She was no longer just Thomas's daughter, she was his intellectual heir, the engineer who would complete his life's work. Barley was a constant, happy presence, supervising the work from a sunny patch of rock, his tail wagging at the friendly hands that now reached out to scratch his ears. One evening, as the sun began to set, Martha stood at the entrance to the cavern, looking out through the shimmering veil of water. The setting sun struck the falling droplets, fracturing the light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Below, the foundation for the great water wheel was nearly complete, a testament to shared labor and renewed hope. The light filtering through the water cast a warm, golden glow over everything, illuminating the scene with a kind of serene magic. Samuel came to stand beside her, not speaking, but sharing the moment of quiet triumph. In this golden light, surrounded by the steady roar of the falls and the evidence of her community's faith, Martha finally felt the last of her grief wash away, replaced by a deep, grounded sense of peace. She had found her father again, not in a grave on a hill, but in the brilliant legacy he had hidden for her. She had found her place, not on the edge of town, but at its very center. And so, we must ask again, what is the true measure of an inheritance? Perhaps it is not something you are given at all. Perhaps it is the hidden potential that lies dormant within us, waiting for a key, waiting for the courage to step through the deafening roar of doubt and into the quiet, light-filled space where our true purpose resides. What waterfalls are you standing in front of, and what secrets might they be hiding?